This is U.S. History Regents Review, Unit 4, video number 4. We finished by talking about what African Americans are experiencing during the Progressive Era. And this is something that had been going on really since the start of Reconstruction and essentially continued almost up through the Civil Rights Movement. And this is lynching, which is a form of racial terror. It's something that is truly horrific. Over 4,000 lynchings took place from the 1880s to the 1950s that are recorded. And these are all in the goal of maintaining white supremacy and keeping African American communities in pure terror. Ida B. Wells is one of the women during this movement who really fought lynching. She would document it and write about it to great personal risk to herself. However, no anti-lynching bills were passed by Congress. Even as they were proposed many times, the federal government never supported it. And in general, it's kind of a big conclusion, no major progress was made for Blacks during the Progressive Era at all. Two of the most famous men who were around at this time really disagreed about what it would mean for African Americans to advance and what they needed and what strategies should be used. So they're often compared on the exam. Booker T. Washington is very famous for his treatment of this issue and also for meeting up with Theodore Roosevelt and having a relationship with him. He was a slave as a child, and he was freed. He, by that experience, was used to slavery and white supremacy and oppression. And just from his experience, he believed fundamentally that racism would end once Black students acquired useful labor skills. So his strategy was that, Blacks should work from the bottom up gradually and slowly and earn the respect of white people. So this made him, somewhat tolerable to certain white leaders and progressives like Theodore Roosevelt. He was invited to the White House to share his ideas because he was really not that threatening. He gave this famous speech called the Atlanta Compromise, where he basically said, we have to compromise on some of the things that we want. And number one, Blacks need opportunities for education and job training. So in that idea, he founded the Tuskegee University, the Tuskegee Institute, to give African Americans opportunities to get skills. Meanwhile, W.E.B. Du Bois really disagreed with this, and he was born free. He was born in the North. He gets a PhD eventually from Harvard, and so he has a really different perspective. He does not have this kind of patience that Washington is talking about. He helped found the NAACP and thought African Americans need to get education, not just education to become domestic servants, but real education in law, medicine, science. And they need to learn, especially about the law, because they need to be able to challenge unjust laws. So that's partially what the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, did and continued to do, and it still exists today. So his strategy was more top-down. We must change laws. He demanded an end to segregation. Booker T. Washington didn't really have a problem with segregation, but Du Bois absolutely did. And one of his ideas was that racism would end using the talented 10th principle. That there's about a 10th of every population that is super talented and that they should be allowed to really advance a society and progress things for all African Americans. But again, I'll reiterate that there were no major gains made for African Americans during this time period. But this is a really important conversation, and we can see how certain leaders disagreed fundamentally on what it meant for Blacks to advance in the United States. So let's switch and look less at the specific issues and more at the overall presidents and what they did. So Theodore Roosevelt, I already mentioned, he had a whole plan for helping people. And his plan was called the Square Deal, equal opportunities for Americans. And this included trust busting. It included support for workers, consumer protection, and conservation. One example of trust busting was in the Northern Securities versus United States Supreme Court case. He used the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Commerce Clause, saying, hey, the government has the right to get involved when something involves two or more states, like railroads. And he busted up a big railroad trust. During a coal mining strike, he went in and helped arbitrate between the miners and the owners of the mines, the Anthracite coal mining strike, because, again, he saw himself as being a president who worked on behalf of the people, like a people's president. And he said, hey, if there isn't coal during the winter, people are going to freeze. I have to step in and do something. And again, he promoted conservation because, again, that's in the benefit of everyone. And consumer protection, it's in the benefit of everyone. He saw himself this way. And eventually, he at first said, hey, I'm not going to run again for re-election. He became president when McKinley was assassinated. So he served almost 2 full terms, but not totally. So he at first said, I'm not going to run again. And then he changed his mind in 1912 when he creates a new party and promises a square deal all around. So we'll talk about that in a second. His hand-picked successor, someone he thought would do all of his policies, was William Howard Taft. Taft ended up being a lot more conservative and traditional than TR and did not want to go beyond the Constitution. He did become the biggest trust buster. He busted up all sorts of trusts. But he, took a more, I wouldn't say laid back approach, but hands off approach because he wanted to follow the Constitution. Eventually, he became a Supreme Court justice, which is what he really wanted to do. He believed in the law. His foreign policy, which we'll talk about later, was dollar diplomacy. And eventually, at the end of his presidency, TR was like, Taft, you really failed me. You did not end up being progressive enough. You passed this tariff I don't like. And he comes back to the United States and he's like, from his African safari, and he's like, yeah, I'm going to run for president again. When he doesn't win the Republican nomination, he forms his own third party called the Progressive Party or the Bull Moose Party because he's as strong as a bull moose. And because this splits the party, anytime you have a third party candidate, split apart the Republican voters and divided them. He did get more votes than Taft, but all this did was end up allowing Wilson to get elected. So here are the three. Here's your bull moose, Roosevelt. Here's Big Taft, the elephant. And then this is Woodrow Wilson. So again, the split in the party allows a Democrat to be elected. And there had not been a Democratic president for a while. Woodrow Wilson. He is a scholar. He was the president of Princeton College. He had a PhD, and he was an idealist. He was a philosophizer about political theory. And with his high education, he had a vision of what he called his plan, new freedom. He was a progressive president who saw all trust as bad, and his reforms went along with this. He's the one who passed the Clayton Antitrust Act and created the Federal Trade Commission to stop unfair competition and break up monopolies. His other domestic reforms included the 16th Amendment, which allowed the federal government to charge income tax, what was called a graduated or progressive income tax, meaning that if you're wealthier, you pay a higher percentage of tax. And he created the Federal Reserve, which regulates the money supply, determines interest rates, and issues currency. If you actually look at this picture over here, you can see where all of our 12 district banks are. And this is still in operation today. And then we'll soon discuss his foreign policy, which included moral diplomacy in World War I. So again, to review, there were 3 progressive presidents: Theodore Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. These guys all had similar things that they cared about, while they carried out things a bit differently and had different foreign policy.